in honor of
This is for
Washington.
General Washington.
I
I was
understand.
like, I see how it is.
Indeed.
All right. Ready? All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lisa Denton. I am the program coordinator for history for the Recreation and Parks History section here. Thank you for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. Just before we get started, a couple of shameless promotions. I do have a back table that has our latest lineup of summer history programs. The next one actually is happening here tomorrow, debuting our Henrico Revolutionary War Bingo at 2 and 7 p.m. So if you want to come and play bingo and learn a little bit about Henrico's 250 years ago history, come join us. We do have a whole long lineup, so please feel free to grab that. Also, I have several of our newsletters printed out, including our latest one that came out, I think it was last month for spring. And I only selected 3 examples that deal with the Revolutionary War era, including one article that Bert contributed to. So feel free to pick up a copy. We also have some 250th swag in the back as well. So please feel free to pick that up at the time the lecture's over with. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. Some of you are familiar with Bert Dunkerly. Bert is a historian, award-winning author, and speaker who is actively involved in historic preservation and research. He holds a degree in history from St. Vincent College and a master's in historic preservation from Middle Tennessee State University. He has worked at 9 historic sites, written now 15 books, and more than 20 articles. His research includes archaeology, colonial life, military history, and historic commemoration. Dunkerly is currently a park ranger at Richmond National Battlefield Park. He has visited more than 400 battlefields and over 700 historic sites worldwide. When not reading or writing, he enjoys hiking, camping, and photography. So let's welcome Bert to share about Washington taking command.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for coming out tonight. As you're going to see, I'm a fan of George Washington. I think he was absolutely the right person at the right time to take command. And what I'm going to do tonight is spend a lot of time actually talking about his background, his early experiences as a young man, and what made him uniquely qualified to take on this role, which was unprecedented, leading a revolutionary army and taking on the world's largest empire. So let's jump right in. That's the Washington family crest, by the way. George Washington was born in 1732 on a plantation in Westmoreland County. Today it's a national park site. Anybody been there? Okay. They actually don't know exactly where the house stood. That's ongoing research and archaeology, but this photo shows you one potential location. It might be right there. This was a moderately wealthy family. The Washingtons were involved in local politics. They were involved in local church. At the county level, the Washingtons were definitely important. Not necessarily important at the larger colonial Virginia level, but Washington's family had a history of public service. His great-grandfather was in the militia. Older brother, half-brother was in the military service. So the Washingtons had that history. And that's what George Washington will grow up with. He does not have a lot of formal education. He does learn surveying, and that will be his path forward as a land surveyor on the frontier being like the Shenandoah Valley and Western Virginia. Now, at this time, the British colonies are along the coast. You see them there in red. And the French are in Canada and what's now the central part of the United States, the Great Lakes area. And those two empires are always at odds. And by the 1750s, when Washington is in his 20s, the two empires are headed towards a collision course. And you may not be able to make out a lot of detail on this map, but the area that is now Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, West Virginia, that's going to be an area that both sides claim, and they're both going to send troops to occupy and try to get alliances from the Native Americans who are living there. They're going to be really key to this. This is a zoomed in map of Western Pennsylvania, and it shows the area I'm going to talk about here for a little bit. You can see Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, Great Lakes up there. The French arrive first and start building forts in this area. You see them there. The British will respond by sending a messenger. The governor of Virginia will send a 21-year-old into that wilderness to deliver a message to the French telling them that they're trespassing, to leave. That's George Washington. He will make this expedition into the wilderness with a handful of companions. It ends up being just one at the end. Washington will write about his experiences. His journal has been republished. You can read it. But Washington will visit important places, like on the bottom you see the forks of the Ohio River. That's to modern-day Pittsburgh today. Looks like a good place for a fort, very strategic. Washington will deliver his message to the French. They're basically going to say, thanks for coming, but no, we're not leaving. But Washington learns a lot of valuable skills. Makes some mistakes along the way. He's learning about diplomacy. He's learning about survival on the frontier. He's learning about interacting with these European officers, British and French. And at one point, he falls in the Allegheny River. You see them, he and his guide, Christopher Gist, crossing on that makeshift raft up there. They had to cross the river. It was wintertime. It was icy. And he fell in the river and, of course, almost got hypothermia and could have died to some unknown, forgotten person. But he survives that experience, survives actually being shot at by a hostile Indian at one point. So amazing, two close calls there. A 21-year-old Washington makes it back to Virginia to deliver the French response. And so the British Virginia response will be to send their own troops into the area, and Washington will command them. Washington will end up actually skirmishing with the French. On the top picture there, you see the Glen. It's called Jumonville Glen. A group of French soldiers were camped there. Washington and his troops will surround them. And it's kind of fuzzy, the details about who shot first and what exactly happened. But that's Washington's first battle. He will then build a fort, very makeshift fort of upright logs, called it Fort Necessity, because they were in a pretty desperate situation, low on supplies, isolated, and outnumbered because the French will come back for revenge. And on July 3rd, this is 1754, the French will attack Washington there at that Fort of Necessity. And the next day, Washington will surrender. And if you didn't catch that, that would be July 4th, 1754. And that would be the only time George Washington ever surrendered. And there he is. You might have seen this picture before. Washington in his uniform of a Virginia militia officer. The British will regroup back to try again to retake this area. General Braddock, Edward Braddock, is going to lead British troops. 2,000 men, massive army. They land in Alexandria, march west over the mountains. Washington joins this expedition, gets a lot of experience working with a large army for the first time, a professional British army. This doesn't go very well for the British. They're actually caught in the woods, not an ambush. They bump into the French, not too far from their objective. It's a very costly engagement, and Braddock himself is killed. Washington has bullets through his hat and his coat. He helps rally and reorganize the troops in the aftermath. He is someone that the other British officers come to depend on. He knows the area, at least more than they do. After Braddock's defeat, for a couple of years, Washington is put in charge of defending the Virginia frontier. And he uses this office in Winchester. And today that's a museum. You can visit his office there. This was probably the most frustrating period of Washington's early career. He doesn't have enough men. He doesn't have enough supplies or money. He's working with a very unsympathetic legislature. The Virginia legislature, which is supposed to be supporting his efforts, are not very helpful. All those things are going to sound very familiar in 20 years for Washington. But he's responsible for defending the entire Virginia frontier from the French and Indians. And I'll just give you some examples of some of his frustrations. As he is supposed to enlist troops and build forts, he's encountering problems like this. 100 militia from Culpeper County were called out. 80 of them came, and 25 deserted. In another instance, 400 men are organized at Winchester, and over 100 of them desert after being paid. So Washington is constantly dealing with raising troops, training them, supplying them, and dealing with enemy raids along the frontier. And if you can see my red dot here, we're talking about this area along the mountains, with the French and the Indians coming in from the north. It's a thankless job. After a couple of years, the British are ready to launch another expedition into the Ohio country and try to retake it again. And it's going to go a little better this time. It's led by General John Forbes. You see him on the right. And his second in command is Colonel Henry Bouquet on the left. And the Forbes expedition will actually start in Pennsylvania and go sort of straight west, whereas the Braddock expedition had come up from Virginia, from the south. So Forbes' army is that blue line, and Braddock's was that red line. Washington will also accompany this army. He commands 2 regiments, a third of the British Army. It's a pretty big assignment. He's never commanded this many men himself before. This process of marching west and crossing over the Allegheny Mountains is grueling. Supply challenges exist all along the way. There's always a threat of ambush as they're marching. They're dealing with some pretty rough terrain crossing the mountains. But what they end up doing is they'll send a small force forward, like Bouquet's force will go forward, and then Washington's force will go next, and then sort of leapfrogging, advancing a couple miles at a time. And in this way, Washington is learning to work with other commanders. He's learning to work independently at times, but always, of course, concerned about supplies and security. I think Washington also learns a couple of other things. General Forbes liked to have what they called a council of war, where he would call his officers together and take their opinion. Here's our problem right in front of us. Here's some potential ideas. What do you all think? And sort of read the room and get input. Something else happens that I think impresses Washington. The British Army gets close to capturing the French fort, Fort Duquesne. But by November, they stop. It's getting cold. The roads are getting impassable. Winter's coming, and Forbes decides, we've done well, but we can't make that last push, the last maybe 20 miles to capture it. We'll have to wait till spring, wait out the winter. But then things change suddenly, as they often can in history. A French deserter shows up. He says the French are low on supplies. A lot of the Indians have deserted them, and the fort is pretty undefended. And so instantly, General Forbes puts his army in motion. They make a couple rapid marches, and they capture the French fort right before Thanksgiving. And it just goes to show that there are times when it looks like the momentum is lost, but you can quickly regain it. Things can turn around very quickly and unexpectedly. This is one of the forts that the British will build, Fort Ligonier. And Washington has another close call here. Some troops are out on patrol, and they bump into other British troops. They're both British, but the two groups bump into each other, and they start to fire on each other by accident. And Washington rides into the mix, knocking up the muskets of the soldiers with his sword, and is almost hit, but obviously isn't. And today this is a museum, reconstructed fort that you can visit. And this was the ultimate objective. The city of Pittsburgh is today. Right there at the intersection of the rivers is where the French fort Duquesne was located. The British will capture it in the fall of 1758. And at that point, Washington resigns. He feels like his days as a soldier are over. He expects to just go back to his plantation at Mount Vernon and end his days farming and running his operations there, never expecting to be called back to military service. Over the next couple of years, the French are defeated. They're driven out of Canada. The British conquer all of that territory. They acquire a lot of debt when they do that. The British will start to tax the Americans to pay for that debt. And of course, that leads to unhappiness and tension with the American colonies. 20 years after all of these events, Washington is a well-established plantation owner, and the Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia to determine not to break away and declare independence at first. They are meeting to decide how to reconcile with the British. That's what they want initially. And things have gone too far. That's just not possible. By 1774 and 1775, and that leads us up to what we're getting at here, the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, 1775, for this year. Fighting breaks out at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts in April. And militia from all over New England swarms to Boston. British troops are in Boston, and the militia surround them there. And at first, no one's sure where this is going. No one thinks or knows that this is going to be the start of a movement to break away and declare a separate country. But this rabble of militia that's assembled outside of Boston needs some leadership. And the Continental Congress chose one of its members, a Virginian, to lead it. Washington was 43 when he was given the assignment. Washington is appointed on June 14th. And when he is given the assignment, he will say, "I declare with utmost sincerity, I do not feel myself equal to the command." When he agrees to accept it, he will do so with no pay. So Washington served as the commanding general of the Continental Army without pay, he asked for expenses. So he kept a journal of travel expenses and things like that to be reimbursed. Washington will leave Philadelphia and travel up to Boston, where the Army is. This is a New England Army. These are men from New Hampshire and Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. There's nobody from any other colonies there yet. And appointing a Virginian, I think, was done very much on purpose to give this cause a wider perspective, to show that all the colonies are united. And so we're going to have a Virginia planter, elite gentleman, coming up to take over this New England Army. In the meantime, before he gets there, the Battle of Bunker Hill happens. And that was on June 17th. So we just passed the 250th anniversary of that. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a costly British victory. They suffered 1,000 casualties. One American said we'd sell them another hill at the same price. Washington will arrive at Cambridge, outside of Boston, on July 3rd, 1775. There are 14,000 troops from all over New England who have surrounded the British in Boston. This is George Washington's first visit to New England. Strange territory, different kinds of people. And he will write that New Englanders are generally the most indifferent people I ever saw, and exceedingly dirty and nasty people. But remember, these are men who have left their homes with probably very little clothing and equipment. They're camped around in makeshift camps. It's very disorganized. It's very loosey-goosey. So Washington has to impose some order on this. He realizes that right away. We do have a British observation on the American Army at the time. A British doctor who happened to visit the American camp wrote this: "It is truly nothing but a drunken, lying, hypocritical rabble, without order, discipline, or cleanliness. Without rum, a New England army could not be kept together. They'd neither fight nor say their prayers." So when Washington arrives, his immediate challenges are to get a handle on the situation, but start to impose some discipline and order to this large group of men. Drill, set in place some routines, set in place some hygiene and cleanliness. But even larger than that, Washington has to build the sense that this is a continental army. And that's what that means. That term means that this is an American national army. It represents, as they said, the continent. Today we say national. They use the term continental. Washington very much wanted these men to think of themselves not as New Englanders or Rhode Islanders or Virginians, but as Americans. James Warren, who was president of the Massachusetts Congress, which was overseeing the state government, wrote, "I pity our poor general, who has a greater burden on his shoulders and more difficulties to struggle with than I think should fall to such a good man. I see he is fatigued and worried." And I didn't mention this. This is the house where Washington will set up in Cambridge as his headquarters. This is also a historic site that you can visit today. Again, a couple more observations from Washington. He wrote that confusion and disorder reigned in every department. However, we mend every day and flatter myself that in a little time we shall work up these material into good stuff. And he also added that they were a mixed multitude of people under very little discipline. Now, through the summer, pull up the map here. So there's Boston. The city of Boston is right there in the middle, surrounded by water. And the British have several thousand troops camped in Boston, but they're hemmed in there. And all around them, surrounding them on all sides, are the American militia camps. So the British are trapped in Boston. They have ships, they have their navy, so they can get supplies. But this is the situation. It's a standoff, and it's going to last for months. So in the meantime, Washington will organize his army, and he will impose discipline and make things orderly. Because, again, no one knows how long this is going to last or where this is going. Well, will the British try to attack and break out of Boston? Will the Americans have to attack them? No one knows how this is going to end. Over the course of that summer, because these are citizen soldiers, the militia will come and go from these New Englanders. A siege is boring. There's not much going on. It's monotonous. And they don't have great food. They don't have great, shelter for camping. So men will leave, new men will arrive. It's a constant revolving door. That's a challenge in and of itself to keep a handle on. Eventually that summer of late summer 1775, troops will arrive from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And now we truly do have a more continental army with these men from these other regions joining the New Englanders. But again, Washington has to build a common cause and a sense of national identity. He would write that an army without order, discipline, and regularity is little better than a commissioned mob. And I think that goes back to some of his earlier experiences working with Virginia militia on the frontier. And all of those other experiences that he had too as a young man, as a young officer, helped him. He has to work with different state legislatures. He has to work with the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So he has to work with an elected assembly for supplies and support, sending them letters about what he needs. Washington will spend a lot of time, and an inordinate amount of his time, creating regulations for the Army, daily routines, inspections, putting together processes and procedures in place because there was nothing to work with. We're starting from scratch. So Washington spends a lot of time ordering that daily drills are done by the troops, that they have inspections, that they dig latrines, that they keep them away from their camps, things like that. One big problem he had were soldiers shooting their guns in camp. Men get bored. Maybe they're just playing around with their muskets. But shooting guns off randomly in camp is not a good idea. So Washington had to put a stop to that. He has to deal with a whole host of issues that maybe he hadn't thought of, because in New England, there are a number of free African Americans, and some of them are here with the militia. Washington was opposed to that, did not want African Americans serving as soldiers. Of course, he comes from Virginia, where there aren't many free African Americans, and there is always the fear of slave insurrection. Eventually, Washington will come around and accept blacks as soldiers. And later on, during the Revolution, the different states will open recruiting to African Americans, all except the southern states. Now here in Cambridge are a couple historic markers. It was dark it was nighttime when I took these pictures. But these show the spot, supposedly, where Washington first arrived and took command of the army in person. So there's a couple monuments there that talk about that. And this is right across from Harvard University. If you don't know that area, the American troops were camped at Harvard. They used some of the buildings as barracks. As time goes on and we go through the fall and into the winter of 75 into 1776, again, this is dragging on. We don't know how long it's going to last. Washington will come to the conclusion that we cannot rely on militia, citizen soldiers. Citizen soldiers are great, but they don't have a lot of skill and discipline, and they want to go home. They'll serve for a little while, but then they want to go home. What they needed was a permanent standing army. That's the term they used. It means a professional army. And Washington would use the term respectable army, an army of men who are trained, they're enlisted for a long period, they have discipline, they're professional soldiers. That's what the British have. And isn't that ironic that Washington realizes to fight the British, who have this well-trained, disciplined army, we have to create the same thing, because the Americans are fighting for freedom and liberty, but yet we have to create an army that can fight them and have those skills. So Washington would advocate with Continental Congress and state governors for troops to be enlisted for a long time, to have the ability to enlist men for several years, not just a short time. And eventually that'll happen, but it takes a little while. But throughout the Revolution, there is that tension between the civilian leadership in the Congress and generals in the Army, the generals insisting that we need professional soldiers who are career soldiers, and the civilian leadership saying that's what we're fighting against. That's tyranny. And they had to strike a happy medium, a balance, and that was a challenge. That debate went on through the whole Revolution. John Adams would say, "We don't trust you generals with too much power for too long a time. Such power should be watched with a jealous eye." And of course, ultimately, when we come out of the Revolution, we have the concept of civilian control over our military, president being commander-in-chief. Well, the siege of Boston goes on through the winter and into the spring of 1776. Again, no one knows how long this is going to last. How long can it last? They can't stay this way forever. Well, something else has happened that's going to tip things in favor of the Americans. The fort in New York called Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga has been captured, and it has a lot of cannons. And the idea is to move those cannons to Boston to help the American army there. And that's done by a man named Henry Knox. You might have heard of Henry Knox. Yeah, big guy. It's an amazing effort because they move these cannons on sleds in the winter over the mountains from through western Massachusetts all the way across the state to Boston with teams of oxen. It's an incredible story. And today there are historic markers along the route of Knox's artillery route, moving those cannons. And the very last one of those markers is here in Cambridge, right near Harvard, saying this is where Henry Knox delivered those cannons, January of 1776. That gives the Americans the edge. The British will pull out of Boston in March. And so in March of 1776, we have the first major American victory of the Revolution. The British evacuate Boston, and they never come back, not to Boston. In the meantime, the war has spread to other places, the Carolinas. The Americans will actually invade Canada, try to take over Canada. So the war has spread. And that fundamental question still needs to be answered. Where is this going? What are we doing? And by the spring and summer of 1776, it's obvious that this has gone too far. There cannot be compromise, and we're going to break away from England. This is not just a protest. Protesting is over. This is a rebellion, a revolution. And obviously, July 1776, that final step is taken with the Americans declaring independence. And Washington will have the Declaration of Independence read to his troops. So July 4th will have a different meaning for George Washington. It was the first time his only time he'd ever surrendered, the first battle he lost, and now it's going to be tied to independence. I want to go back to July of 1775, which would be 250 years ago this year, coming up. On July 4th, 1775, a year before independence, no one saw that coming. These were Washington's orders to his army camped outside of Boston. Shed some light on the things he's dealing with and what his day-to-day workload is. And he wrote, July 4th, 1775, exact returns to be made by the proper officers of all the provisions, ordnance, stores, powder, lead, tools, tents, camp kettles, and other stores in their respective care belonging to the Army at Roxbury and Cambridge. The commanding officer of each regiment to make a return of the number of blankets wanted to complete every man with at least one. The Continental Congress, having now taken all the troops of the several colonies which have been raised for the support and defense of the liberties of America into their pay and service, they are now the troops of the United Provinces of North America. And it is hoped that all distinctions of colonies will be laid aside so that one and the same spirit may animate the whole, and the only contest be who shall render on this great and trying occasion the most essential service to the great and common cause we are now engaged in. It is required and expected that exact discipline be observed, due subordination prevail through the whole army, as a failure in these most essential points must necessarily produce extreme hazard, disorder, confusion, and end in shameful disappointment and disgrace. The general most earnestly requires and expects due observance to the articles of war, which forbid profane cursing, swearing, drunkenness, and in a like manner expects of all officers and soldiers a punctual attendance to divine service. All officers are required and expected to pay diligent attention to keep their men neat and clean, to visit them often at their quarters, and inculcate them upon the necessity of cleanliness essential to their health and service. So you can see a lot of the things Washington is dealing with and some of his thoughts about how this army has to be run. I think that's it for photos. So going forward, of course, Washington will command the Continental Army for the whole war through final victory at Yorktown. And the things that he experienced as a young man on the frontier, learning about raising troops, dealing with the legislature, the issues of supply and command, having councils of war with your officers to get their opinions. All of those things he brings to his experiences 20 years later. And Washington, throughout the Revolution, is consistently pushing for professionally trained soldiers, long enlistments, but is always aware of being subordinate to civilian leadership with the Continental Congress. And the last example of that I'll share is that at one point during the war, when the Army is in New Jersey and they're very desperate for food and supplies, Washington authorizes the troops to take from civilians. He knows that's not going to be popular, but he knows that the men will literally starve if they don't have food. But what he tells them to do, the way they do it, is that they work with the local county governments in New Jersey to requisition food for the army. So they don't just go in and take it. They work with the local civilian leadership. And Washington at that point said that we must do this with a reverence for their rights. So he clearly understood that that was important. Again, I think the right person for the right job at the right time. So thank you for coming. I hope you maybe learned something new tonight. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Bert, you talked about young George Washington from a good family in the colony, Royal Colony of Virginia. But before he gets much out of his 20s, he's having to deal with the French troops out in Ohio Territory and in the hills and mountains of western Pennsylvania. Later he'll get Baron von Steuben in to help him drill his American army. Does he speak any foreign languages at all?
That's a great question.
A chance to learn any foreign languages in Virginia.
Right. So, yeah. So the question is, did Washington speak any foreign languages? And he did not. And actually, that was a problem because at that first battle, Fort Necessity, when he was fighting the French, they offered him surrender terms that had him sign the paper saying he admitted he assassinated the other French commander at Jumonville. Washington was relying on a Dutch translator to translate that for him, and it was mistranslated. But the point is, no, he did not. So when French officers arrive, they're going to have translators. Von Steuben doesn't speak any English. He'll have to have translators helping with him. So that was a challenge. But yes.
Was that the first British encounter in the new colonies as far as a military encounter? Was Braddock out there on his own kind of the first time around?
Yeah, so the question is, was Braddock's campaign the first major British expedition into the frontier, the wilderness? It was. The British and French had been fighting for 100 years by then, and there had been other battles in North America, but this was the largest up to that point. Braddock has 2,000 men and about 20 cannons, and that was a large expedition to go away from the settled area into the wilderness to attack the French directly. And the British didn't have the logistics, the ability to build their road and supply their troops. They didn't have a lot of support from the Native Americans. That was a critical breakdown. So there was a lot of reasons why it failed.
So were they building their own roads?
Yeah, yes. In both of the Forbes and Braddock campaigns, they were building the road as they went. So what they had to do, picture what West Virginia looks like, or Western Pennsylvania, very mountainous. They send, scouts out, and then behind the scouts are the road builders with guards. And once they complete a section of road, the army can move, and the process just keeps going forward. That, they make 3-4 miles a day. Yeah, tough work.
So were the French supplying Indians with weapons at that point?
A question about the French and the Indians. It's important to remember that the Indians are not necessarily pro-French or pro-British. They're pro-Indian, and so they're always looking out for their own interests, like anybody is. And at the time, in the early 1750s, the French are the ones who are on the ascendance. The French have trade goods. They have a powerful military coming into the area. So it looks like the French are the way to go. So the French will supply weapons to the Indians. Obviously, the Indians can't make and supply their own weapons. But as things start to turn later in the French and Indian War, and the British get the upper hand, a lot of the Indian tribes will switch sides. Not a criticism. They're looking out for that's their territory. They're trying to defend their homeland. So a lot of them will switch sides. And during the American Revolution, a lot of the Indian tribes will side with the British, who will make them offers of protecting their homeland. Some will side with the Americans, but fewer. Just depends on who's offering the better deal. Anybody else?
I want to ask you questions, so I'd like to-
Well, that's you can keep asking questions, and I'll be here afterwards so we can talk.
You would be here. So there's a cultural clash between the northern troops and the southern troops when they finally come together. Because these cultures are pretty much different. Right? In South,
Yeah.
plantations, in the north, it's more individual farmers, manufacturers. Right? So how does that work? How does that work out? Who's putting this all together?
So the question is about the cultural differences between the Americans. It's tempting to look at it as a North-South thing, but I think the Civil War clouds that memory for us. I think it's more helpful to think of it in terms of these people are from very different regions. Obviously climate, but religion. So we have different religious groups in New England, the Middle Colonies, Southern Colonies. We have different ethnic groups. Like here in Virginia, there's a lot of Scotch-Irish, a lot of German, especially on the frontier, Shenandoah Valley. There are whole communities that don't speak English. In North Carolina, there are Highland Scots. In other areas, you've got French Huguenots. Economic differences. Small farms in New England, very democratic local governments. Here in Virginia and in southern colonies, it's more plantation with enslaved labor force. So just all those cultural differences. And yeah, there were tensions when these troops got together from the different colonies and Washington's trying to create a Continental Army. You've got different dialects, phrases, different languages, different religions, different cultural values. There were some tensions, there were some fistfights, there were some blows, but ultimately they're in a common cause, as Washington said, and he had to build on that. But yeah, there were times when it got interesting. Yes.
One more question. If we look ahead, Cheryl Wilson, once again, did a lot of work for a statewide commemoration that she did for the Civil War and World War I, World War II. So Virginia 250, well, I know depend upon the National Park Service for help. They've already got traveling exhibits going around the Commonwealth of Virginia. Do you see this moving in the direction we want to go over the next year? Come up on the 250th anniversary of 1776?
Just so I'm sure, you're asking that you think that the Virginia 250 effort is on the right track?
Right.
I mean, I think it is. The traveling history mobile that he talked about is going to visit every county. If you haven't seen it, you'll have the chance to. There's a great exhibit here at the History Museum in Richmond. Our local county is going to be doing some things, and some of the important themes or some of the stuff we're talking about here, like this diverse group of people that come together to run the revolution, to see this thing through, the different experiences that different people have. So yeah, I think that we're going to focus on those stories and those different perspectives, and I think there's going to be a lot of preservation of battlefields and new museum exhibits and all those kind of positive things. So yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all. If anybody wants to come up and talk more informally, please come on up. Lisa, did you have any final announcements? We're done? All right.